Well, hello, folks out there in YouTube land. Got a big show lined up for you. Let's get right on into it. All right, folks, the two most anticipated new quarterbacks, I think, certainly in the SEC, are these two fellas right here. Brock Vandergriff for Kentucky, and, of course, Nico for us Vols. And I know there's some more out there that are highly anticipated, but these two guys really are. And, oh, by the way, yesterday I made a mistake, and it's on this right here. I put Clemson once out 2 T-O instead of T-O-O, and, man, did I hear about it. Jeez.
Now Kane. Well, they're a tag team now.
Yeah, they were using the chairs. They were coming off the top rope. They were doing everything. I spend a lot of time in the comment section, usually, reading and responding. And there was at least a dozen comments about that. And some of them were not too kind.
Oh, well, pardon me, Mr. Perfect. I guess I forgot that you never ever make a mistake.
So anyway, sorry about that. I actually remember doing that title thinking, is it T-O or T-O-O? And I should have Googled it, but I had like 19 other things I was working on in that video, and I thought, well, I'll just risk it. Mistake. But the nice thing about YouTube, if you make a mistake, you will hear about it. I promise you. All right, so let's talk about Brock Vandergriff. Now, this guy was a 5-star coming out of high school, and he's been at Georgia for 3 years. He spent 2 years behind Stetson Bennett, who was the greatest walk-on in the history of football, I think, winning 2 natties. And then he sat a year behind Carson Beck. And Carson Beck was a 4-star coming out of high school, the number 234 player in the country. But he has turned out to be a really good player. Now, he sat behind Stetson and finally got the starting position, and he's played really, really well. And he also really enjoys buying Lambos and has been busy doing that with his multi-million-dollar contract there at Georgia. But Brock never really got a chance there. He was always trying to win the starting job and just never was able to do it. Now, this guy's a heck of a quarterback. I mean, he broke all the records, of course, in high school and did all that. And he's following up Dennis Leary, who came from NC State. Now, I thought Dennis Leary was going to play pretty well for Kentucky, and he was kind of middling. He didn't really do all that much. And that was disappointing to the Kentucky folks because they really need a good quarterback. I mean, you have to have a good quarterback in the SEC. I mean, it's just the way that it is. Otherwise, you're going to struggle. Now, Leary played a good game against us with our defensive secondary, which is no shock. I think everybody pretty much did, which is why we have a whole new secondary this year. But I think Brock Vandergriff was a great get for Kentucky. I mean, it's really hard to get a 5-star anyway, especially one that's very mature. I think this is a really good fit for them. And that's the great thing about the transfer portal. I know a lot of people get frustrated by it, but do you really think a 5-star should have to sit forever at a school and never get to transfer out and play somewhere unless he has to pay a 1-year penalty? I mean, hey, he tried to become the starter at Georgia, which is really hard to do. They have a ton of quarterbacks there, and they're all really, really good. So he wound up finishing second, whereas he probably could have started for a lot of clubs, but at Georgia, that's not easy. So now he gets to go to Kentucky and be the starter, and he's the obvious starter there. And that's great for a young man to be able to get off that bench and finally, after 3 years of sitting, finally get to play. And Kentucky's thrilled to have him, I'm sure. They've got to be. So that's one of the things I really like about the transfer portal. As a former Division I player myself, not in football, obviously. Do I look like a football player? I played on the golf team over at UT. And you don't want to sit on the bench, man. You want to play. And this guy's going to get that opportunity. So I consider him to be he might be the most anticipated quarterback that starts this year because everybody wants to see what this guy can do. Now, the other fella that's highly anticipated, probably in the whole country, is Nico Iamaleava. Now, this guy was the number 1 player coming out of high school and the number 1 quarterback, depending on which service you use. One place would have had him second. But he pretty much sat on the bench behind Joe Milton for a year. He was a true freshman, skinny guy, only about 190 pounds, 6'6" when he came in. Now he's like 210, 220, and he's already played 1 formal game. I mean, pretty much he was just coming in the 4th quarter just during mop-up duty. But he has played 1 game that mattered, and that was the Citrus Bowl. And everybody was fired up to see what he could do. And he threw and ran for 4 touchdowns in his first game against a top 10 defense, which is Iowa. Now, Iowa's offense is not top 10 by any stretch. I think they were one of the worst in the country. But their defense was quite good. And he looked like he knew what he was doing, and it was his very first start. And that's difficult. When you start for the first time to go out and have to play in that national spotlight in a bowl game with 8 million people watching, playing against a top 10 defense, that's not easy. And if you think it is, ask the young man from Florida State who was a true freshman that started against Georgia. That didn't go so well. And he was talking a little bit of smack before the game, which I was like, don't do that. Don't do that. The last thing you want to do is get Georgia all fired up and showing up with blood in their eyes over nothing, over really a football game nobody really cared about because they had gotten creaked out of the playoffs. So had Georgia. And it wound up just being a travesty of a game because all of FSU's best players opted out. And Georgia showed up with all their best players ready to go because that's Georgia. They don't care what it is. They're going to show up and give, it's something about Kirby Smart, something in the water. But it's very difficult to start. It just is. Even the Ohio State freshman, they had a 5-star. He played in the bowl game, and they only scored 3 points. Now, they had a backup that was supposed to be playing. He got hurt, so they throw this freshman in there, and he couldn't do much. It's just really hard when you've not played any live game action to go out there and play at a high level. Nico didn't have any trouble with that. And look, he got sacked 6 times. We had a makeshift offensive line. We had 3 guys out that were supposed to be playing that couldn't because of either injury or they'd opted out. So we just kind of put who we could out there against a very tough front 7. And he handled it just fine. Like I said, he scored 4 touchdowns, and we won 35-0 or whatever. And that had a lot to do with Iowa's offense being terrible.
How dare you!
But this year we're going to get to see the full thing. We're going to get to see a whole season. Hopefully, neither one of these guys get injured. You always got to worry about that with every football player in football. But these are the 2 most anticipated that I can think of right now. You may completely disagree. I'm sure there's others. And I may, take a look at some of these other quarterbacks too. These are just the 2 that I find most interesting. A 5-star that was sitting on the bench right behind Stetson Bennett and then Carson Beck, who I think will probably play really well for Kentucky. And then, of course, Nico. I mean, Nico might be the most anticipated player at quarterback in the country. It's close between him and a few other dudes. So anyway, I did want to cover this because this is exciting. I'm sure Kentucky's over the moon that they were able to get a 5-star like this, especially one that's mature and isn't going to be frail or anything like that, because you don't want to put just some little 5-star out there that's 18 years old. They'll get killed in the SEC. That was why we held off Nico so much, I think. A lot of people thought that he should get to play more, especially as Joe had some struggles here and there. But, man, you put out a little 190-pound, 6'6" guy, and even as quick as he is, I call him a tall Bryce Young. I think he's that good, and I know a lot of people call him that. But it's not easy to go out there at 190 pounds in the SEC. I mean, these are full-grown men that are, that are looking to tackle you, and they would love to punish a freshman. So it's always a risk, but this should be fantastic. Watching these 2 guys play, I'll definitely be watching the Kentucky games and to see how this guy tees it up. And, of course, Nico, everybody's going to be watching Nico. He was the $8 million man. And the NCAA, of course, went after us. And you saw what we did to the NCAA.
You're all clear, kid. Now let's blow this thing and go home.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we took care of that Death Star real good. And, hey, NCAA, you want a little more, don't you? Well, come right on back. We'll finish you off real good.
You walk over with your limping back.
I don't ever want us to settle with them. I want to pound them into dust, and then we'll rebuild them into something that we can use for basketball or, whatever, because a lot of this is probably going to end up with super leagues, and we'll probably have conferences that are in control of football, and the next few years going to be unbelievable. There's going to be so much change, we're not going to be able to keep up. I'll just go ahead and tell you, it's coming, and it's coming fast. So anyway, if you like this content, be sure to hit that like button. Let's continue to cover all this big college news, of course, my Vols, the SEC, and all these other big stories. If you've not subscribed, it's on your right, my left. You hit this little button right here. It will cost you not a dime, and it helps me out. I would appreciate it. And right over here is most recent video, YouTube. Thanks, you'll enjoy. And we'll see you next time on Sports Talk Jay.